Hi, this is Emerald and welcome to the Diamond Net, and today I'm going to be talking to you about self-deception. So this video is going to be all about the little lies that we tell ourselves, about self-deception, and about how to be more self-honest. Several weeks ago, I had Rally from Naked Reality on my show, and he shared with me a quote from Adyashanti saying, "Only the phonies don't get enlightened." Now, I think there could be a misinterpretation that many people might make from this quote to think, oh yeah, I have to be real to other people. I have to be honest with other people. But being honest with other people is fairly simple, but being honest with the self is a lot more difficult because sometimes we just don't want to look at the truth of how we are. So when it comes to lying to others versus lying to the self, when we lie to others, we generally know that we're lying. When we lie to ourselves, we generally don't realize it. We know at a deep level that it's a lie, but we may just not want to face that aspect of reality. And this is what obscures the truth from us. If you watched my last week's video on shadow work, I even talked about how self-deception is at the root of the problem of the shadow. That's what causes the shadow in the first place, because we don't want to see reality as it is. We put on our blinders and we ignore things in reality and we repress them away from our experience. But this is the very thing that causes a distorted and unwise experience of reality. So if you're familiar with my channel and with my backstory, you'll know that I had two experiences of ego-transcendence when I was 20 years old. And one of the most uncanny and most profound things about that experience was that all of a sudden I could see through my self-lies. Like, I did not know that I was constantly lying to myself every day. I thought that I was a very honest person, and I thought that, I knew exactly who I was. But I saw very quickly, once the self-concept became of no importance to me, once that was no longer my focus and the thing that I was trying to protect and maintain, all of a sudden I was able to see so much more of the truth, and I saw how I was habitually lying to myself constantly, trying to prop myself up as this particular person. And I would lie to myself about my preferences, about the emotions that I was feeling, about how I felt about myself, how I felt about other people, all of those things in service to my self-concept. But for those brief experiences, I had no care of being the steward of that self-concept. And so all of a sudden, all of my traits that I had repressed, all of the traits that had been in my shadow, suddenly came back into my awareness. And it wasn't just the traits themselves, it was just this whole entire energy that came with it. It was as though it took a lot of energy from me just to repress those traits away, and it sapped me of so much wisdom and awareness of what was true in my experience that, just the experience of reintegrating those traits caused me to feel so much more aware and to be so much more in tune with what was. But one thing's for sure is that I was absolutely shocked by the amount of lies that I was telling myself. Like, literally constantly lying internally. Like multiple lies in the course of 5 minutes, to where it was like, oh my gosh, I cannot believe that I've been believing myself this whole entire time. I can't believe that I was so mistaken about so many things in my reality simply because I wasn't willing to face the truth. So this is why I must stress to you the importance, when you're doing any kind of consciousness work, to accept the fact that you're most likely lying to yourself 99% of the time. Now, as I mentioned before, I thought of myself as a very, very honest person. I really wanted to be a straight shooter for people. I wanted to make sure that people knew that the things that I said carried a certain amount of weight to them and that they could take what I had to say to the bank. And so I would always judge very, very dishonest people as like bad or mistrustful. And I mean, in some senses, rightly so. You can't really trust a person who's dishonest because you don't really know what's underneath their lies. Like, for example, I used to live next door to this man when I was a teenager, and I was 15. He was probably late 20s, early 30s, something like that, maybe around my age now. And, he was a really nice guy. He did a lot of, like, really good things. Like, he was really into heavy metal, and he was even teaching me how to play the guitar and everything at the time. But the thing about him was that he was a pathological liar. He was just constantly lying all the time. And I relate it now to, I think he was just kind of ashamed of the way that he was. Like, he just could not be a straight shooter. I don't really necessarily think that he was a bad person, but the thing is, you couldn't trust anything that he had to say. And if somebody were to tell me now, oh, did you know that that guy did some heinous crime? I would be like, oh, well, maybe that is true, because he never really showed his true face. So with him, it was like if his lips were moving, he's lying. And I was always thinking, how is it possible that someone could just lie all the time? Is he like in his head like, I'm gonna lie to everyone, I'm gonna mislead everyone? And, you know, having experienced this experience of realizing how much I lie to myself, I entertained the possibility that he maybe had no idea that he was constantly lying. That might have just been a blind spot for him. And it was just maybe a more extreme version of what most people have anyway. And when I say most people, I mean almost all people. So, like my buddy next door, the ego is just like that. If its lips are moving, it's lying. So chances are, if you're thinking something, particularly if you're thinking something about yourself and your relationship to the world, which is most thoughts in your mind, most thoughts are self-referential in that way, chances are that is a self-lie. But the main reason that we lie is to preserve the self-concept in some way, or to serve our needs that we need to have met, or our desires. So the ego sort of works in a self-congratulatory and self-deprecating manner. So it might make up stories like, oh yeah, I'm a lot more hardworking than these people, or my perspective is right because of this, or, oh, you know, I would never lie to anybody because I'm such a good person. So that's on the self-congratulatory end of ego thoughts, like that whole process of creating that identification with the self-concept. Or sometimes we have self-deprecating thoughts where we think, oh, I'm never going to fit in, I'm so different from everyone else, no one's ever going to like me. And then we start getting into victim's mentality. And really this serves the self-concept too, because number one, it's very easy to attach onto those ideas. They're not true, but they're very easy to attach onto. You can also feel a sense of self-pity, which has a little bit of pleasure to it. If you notice that, if you've ever felt the experience of self-pity, you'll notice like just this little seed of pleasure in taking pity on the self, a little relief. And then also, it can be a perfect excuse for avoiding difficult things in life, because you're just too much of a victim, too much under the wheel of life to even do anything about it and to change anything. Either way, these self-lies, these ego thoughts, work to create this sense of separation between yourself and reality where there is none. So these thoughts must necessarily be a lie. So if you're self-congratulatory, you're focused on yourself as a separate entity when there's no separation there, so that must be a lie. Or if you're focused on yourself negatively, it's the same thing. You're thinking of yourself as being separate and different from everything else. So when it comes to consciousness work, you want to think about becoming aware of self-deception as like one of the most important tools in your arsenal. So think about the human being, just this whole experience of being human, as you're learning to play an instrument. This is like bare basic, like learning the scales if you're learning to play an instrument. You know, you want to make sure that you can pick out whenever you're deceiving yourself. And once you sort of get the flavor for what self-deception feels like, then you can start to weed out those self-deceptions and you can start to recognize it. And you can play the instrument of humanity a lot more beautifully and a lot more easefully and a lot more richly than you would have been able to before. But how do we spot a self-deception? That's the real trick, because if we're not aware that we're self-deceiving, it's difficult to become aware, because the conundrum is that you're always 100% aware of what you're aware of, and you can't see anything beyond your awareness, because if you did, then that would be the end point of your awareness. So it becomes difficult to recognize this tendency in ourselves. So I'll talk about how this self-deception sort of works and sort of feels, so you can sort of pinpoint it in your own experience. So one thing that you want to keep in mind is that most thoughts that are self-referential, so any thoughts with an I, me, or mine, are most likely going to be based in self-deception, because you're making some kind of statement about the self, and the self is not inherently a real thing. That's just a concept placed upon this experience that you're having. Necessarily, the vast majority of that is going to be a lie. Unless you're describing some temporal state like, oh, I'm hungry. That's not a self-deception. That's just noticing that you have that feeling of hunger. So you want to go eat. So that's not a self-deception. But if you say something like, oh yeah, I'm a good person, that's a self-deception, because it relies on the concept of you as a separate person being able to attain some objective standard of goodness, which of course, good and bad are defined in different ways depending on the person you're talking to. Another really common signifier that you're lying to yourself is if you're rationalizing away emotions and urges. So let's say, for example, someone hurts your feelings and you start to feel like you're going to cry. But then that's embarrassing to you to cry because you have this idea in your mind that crying is weak. And so you lie to yourself and you say, no, this doesn't hurt me that much. I'm just pissed off, like I don't have to cry. I'm not doing that. That type of denial, that direct denial of feelings that we have. Or maybe you're attracted to somebody and you don't want to admit that to yourself, and you say, no, I'm not. I don't even really like that person as a person because X, Y, and Z reason. So you're basically taking the mind and you're trying to override a physical reality that is your emotions. Another thing you want to watch out for is like absolute statements, like statements that are like always and never. So like, oh, I'm always honest all the time, and that's what makes me a good person. Or, oh, I never show up late to work, and that means I'm a really dependable person. Again, these are very self-referential thoughts, but you'll notice that they tend to work in absolutes, where a person picks out a handful of traits that they consider to be the most important and either tries to make themselves fit this mold in their mind and saying, oh, I'm the best at these traits, or they may go in the opposite direction and start saying, oh, I have so many barriers to these traits, I just can't measure up to those standards, and that becomes the excuse, that becomes the rationalization for why you are the way that you are. So you're, again, rationalizing things away. It becomes self-referential once again. Another sign that you're lying to yourself is if you're rationalizing something to somehow protect the self-image. So for example, a year and a half ago, I lost my job. Now, during that time, I was having some difficulties with classroom management, and I was actually having problems. Now, I do genuinely think it was an overreaction to fire me at the end of the year, but at the same time, immediately my ego went into defensive mode, like, oh, this is completely unfounded. How would you do this? And I was pregnant at the time too, so I was upset about that, and I was like, oh, this is definitely pregnancy discrimination. And I do think that that was a factor, but at the same time, there was this tendency to want to paint myself as completely competent in this and like a 100% victim in that situation, because that made me the good guy and that made them the bad guy and them absolutely wrong. Because if I were to accept that maybe I was not doing my highest quality work, or maybe I just wasn't able to hack it at that position, that could be very painful for my self-concept. So it's one of those things, like I could watch it directly in my own experience, despite knowing about self-deception. Sometimes we just don't want to look at the truth, that sometimes we maybe have these traits or do things that are undesirable to us. Another example of how a self-lie feels is like if we are coming up with excuses for justifying the way that we are. Because number one, we don't feel okay as we are somehow, but in our justifying, it further compounds that. So let's say, for example, that I'm a really clingy person and a person feels uncomfortable about that. And they go, hey, I would really like it if you weren't so clingy. And then I say, oh, well, I'm really sorry, but, I was abandoned as a child, and I had a lot of problems from that, and this is the reason why I am the way that I am. And that could very well have been a factor if that's what your past is like. But at the same time, it doesn't necessarily, what's happening now doesn't necessarily have to do with that. It's just another excuse to be able to not take full responsibility for your own actions. And even though it can be good to have insights into why you are the way that you are, it's important to not use those as crutches to kind of explain away behaviors that you would be best to resolve and deal with. Another example of how self-lies look is if you're making comparisons between yourself and others. Like if you find yourself thinking about like, oh yeah, look at that other person, they're doing this, I would never do that. Or, oh, maybe this person's doing that thing, but I do that thing a little better. Oh, or maybe this person's doing really great and wow, I could never match up to that. All of these things, this internal dialogue of comparing yourself to others, and that creates that distinction of a separate self. And again, that is an illusion. It might be difficult to see that that's an illusion, but it is. And so anything that distances other people and says, this is me and that's not me over there, is a self-lie or just a plain out mistake and just a lack of seeing that connection. Another way to tell that you're lying to yourself is if you find yourself quantifying your worth in some way. Like if you're somehow trying to make yourself more worthwhile in some way, or if you feel less worthwhile. So if you're saying, oh, I have to match up to these standards, so I'm the most valuable person. Now, oftentimes we don't think this directly. It's more of an underlying thing because we tend to look down on giving signifiers of worth from person to person, at least if we consider ourselves a good, compassionate person. But this quantifying worth is a natural outgrowth of ego, so it's good to become aware of that. And if you notice yourself struggling to make yourself more valuable in some way than other people, it's good to be able to notice that in yourself. Another example of self-lies is overtly negative judgments of the self or others. Again, that creates that separation. Also, human identity works in a very interesting way where you can start to become identified with things that are beyond the physical body. So for example, let's say that I identify myself as a spiritual person. In identifying as a spiritual person, maybe somebody who dislikes spirituality and puts down spirituality, all of a sudden, because I'm identified with it, maybe I might feel a little slighted. So this process of identification, that has a lot to do with self-lies as well. But for example, if we start to become identified with another person, like a celebrity or a political figure, we might have a tendency to create similar blind spots for them that we would for ourselves in order to justify our own behavior. So for example, if I'm identified with myself, I might overlook my tendencies toward judgment, toward greed, toward anything that I consider negative. If I identify with a political figure, even if they do something negative, then I'm going to see it as being positive because I have a positive idea about them. Also works the other way around. If you don't like someone, just de facto, it doesn't matter what they do, you're going to see their behavior as negative. So for example, I have a family member of mine who voted for Donald Trump, and we got into a conversation about it, and I was pretty surprised because of a lot of his rhetoric during his campaign and a lot of things that came out about him, particularly the grab him by the you-know-what thing, and that would be something that this person would not be for at all. And I said, well, what about that? Were you okay with that? And she said, well, no, but at the same time, there's locker room talk, and, he probably didn't really mean it. He was probably putting on, so it's the same, explaining away something that you would normally not be okay with in other people, and it can happen when you identify with others as well. Now, there are a zillion other forms that self-lies take. Again, probably if you're thinking, you're probably lying to yourself. It's really that profound. It would be very, very uncommon that a person would be past self-lies completely. Again, that would probably be like something that someone with full-blown enlightenment no longer needs to do and just sees right away. But otherwise, if you have not transcended the ego or had the experience ever of transcending the ego, it will be a very big eye-opener to see how often you lie to yourself. So one of the main ways to let go of self-lies is to realize that you're constantly lying to yourself. So just know and constantly be on your guard that most likely most of your thoughts about yourself that are self-referential are lies. All right, the second thing is to let go of identity attachments. The reason why we lie to ourselves in the first place is so that we can preserve a self-image. And our self-image can get quite complex with very many attachments to ideas, to certain traits, to certain people and things that we like. So we have this huge complex web of attachments. The average person does. So what you're going to want to start doing is letting go of those attachments. Now I have a video on this on my channel called Identification and Attachment. If you want to look that up, that should help you in this process. But basically, you just want to recognize that none of these traits actually make you important. None of these traits actually add any value to you. And so you just let them go. And with that, you're just letting go of baggage. And so when you let go of that baggage, you no longer have to cope with it by lying to yourself. So for example, if you identify as a good person, sort of play devil's advocate and say, hey, you know, what if I'm actually not a good person? I mean, if you think about it, I don't think that very many people think they're the bad guy. Like if you think about someone like Hitler, he probably thought he was completely justified in his actions, you know, despite doing very heinous things. And so you have to understand that nobody thinks they're the bad guy. So if you identify as a good person, you have to sort of be able to ask, am I actually a good person, or is that just an idea? Number 3, recognize your judgments about how things should and should not be, and then realize that those judgments are fairly arbitrarily chosen. So for example, if you consider yourself a proper, sophisticated person who's well educated, there might be this tendency to judge people who are not proper and sophisticated and educated as inferior or trashy in some way. But if you belong to that group that's judged, that group that's more trashy, chances are you have your own judgments toward people who are on the opposite end of the spectrum as well. So you might think, oh, I don't need to be snobby like those sophisticated yuppies over there. You know, I have worldly knowledge and I like to keep things simple. I don't need to get all intellectual in my head about it. Let's just keep it a simple thing and we'll be real. Now, of course, neither one of these judgments is in any way reflective of something that's objectively good or objectively bad. It's just a way to be. But when we have those judgments, we have a tendency to think that, oh, people who are like this are better and people who are like this are worse. So when you recognize that there's no 100% consensus on what's a better or worse way to be, then you can start to drop those judgments. And when you drop those judgments, self-lies become obsolete. They become obsolete because you no longer have to protect your self-image from those things that you've been judging so harshly. Another way to drop self-lies is to stop taking the identity so seriously through just seeing how arbitrary the circumstances of your life are. If you think about it, you could just as easily have been born as Hitler, you could just as easily have been born as Mother Teresa or the person down the street. Right now it's quite arbitrary that you're actually experiencing the experience of being the exact person that you are. And so with the circumstances of your life come your character, come all of the choices that you make, and chances are, if you grew up as Hitler and you were raised in the same exact environment and you had the same exact genetics, you would have done the same exact thing Hitler did. You know, it's really quite arbitrary that you're born as you. Also, if we look at this lack of control over the circumstances even deeper, if you look at all of the systems that occur within the body, you have to also realize that the thoughts run on the same kind of system. And so you don't really actually choose your thoughts just kind of spring up, and it's nothing that you actually have control over. And so if you happen to have righteous thoughts, thoughts that are good and pleasant and non-violent, then you should be very grateful because you could just as easily have been born as someone who has very negative thoughts, who has very violent thoughts, who doesn't have peace. But when we start to detach ourselves in this way to our own character, to the very circumstances of our being us, then these self-lies sort of fall away because we see that we don't need to be any particular way. We are just the way that we are, and it becomes more easy to accept. Another way to become aware of a self-lie and to avoid the tendency to lie to yourself is to recognize the underlying motives for why you're lying to yourself. So for example, when I was in college, I used to tell myself this lie that I can never fail because I will always get the job done. And in a sense, this was a good affirmation for me because it gave me results. But at the same time, I had set it up under such high pressure, and it really meant my own self-worth to me. So underlying all of that, it was I can never fail, and people who do fail are not as good as people who don't, and therefore I'm much better than people who don't fail because I work so hard, and if other people work so hard, then they wouldn't fail either, so I'm superior because of that. So that's really the underlying root as to why I adopted that philosophy in the first place. It all became about me proving my own self-worth to me through contrast with other people. But if I look at that thought just right offhand, oh, I never fail, it sounds like a motivational, sort of positive affirmation. But underneath it, there are some very negative motivators there. So if you see those, then you realize, oh, hey, maybe I have a problem with feeling inferior, or maybe I, need to address some deeper issues. Maybe this isn't actually going to make me feel any better. Maybe I have to actually cultivate self-love instead. Another thing you can do is to recognize the futility of maintaining the self-concept. Understand that there's not really going to be a huge payoff in the end for maintaining that identification. What it's just going to do is it's going to beget more judgment. It's going to keep you in a prison of your own judgments. So for example, let's say if I lie to myself and I say, oh, I'm a really hardworking person, and people who aren't as hardworking are lazy and therefore not as worthwhile, then that's going to tie my hands, and suddenly it's going to be meaning a whole lot more to me if I happen to take a day off. If I happen to take a day off, then all of the judgments like, oh, I'm so lazy, oh, this and that, and then you can never relax. So through this, you can see how much energy that you expend just trying to maintain your self-concepts, because we have a billion of these little self-concepts, these billions of little lies that we tell ourselves that we constantly need to protect. So with this little example alone, we could see how that little self-identification, that little self-lie can rob us of so much of our time and energy, and we become in this perpetual mode of protecting that self-image and letting that self-image continue to be strong and proliferate, and the judgment that can be directed back upon the self for not maintaining that image. But if we notice the futility of that identification, we can notice that, oh, the idea that I'm a hardworking person, that's just an idea that I placed over myself. That has nothing really to do with reality. And even if I were a hardworking person, doesn't make me worth anything more. Maybe being hardworking is a good trait to have here and there, but having that identification isn't helping me any. So it's really quite futile to even identify in that way because it doesn't give me any payoff. So in this way, we don't have to worry about that concept being harmed in any way. So for example, we can appreciate hard work and we can do hard work, but if we happen to have a lazy day, that doesn't undermine our self-image because we haven't identified ourselves as being an inherently hardworking person. So from this realization, we can start to allow our internal happenings and our feelings and our moods that might vary with our self-concept in the same way that we might accept an external circumstance that we don't relate to ourselves. So for example, if I don't identify anymore as a hardworking person, I can go and I could say, oh, okay, well, maybe today I'll be hardworking and then tomorrow I'll take the day off. And you can kind of switch a little bit more. That way, when you see the desire to take the day off the next day, you don't overreact to it and say, oh my God, that undermines my self-concept. You can just look at it as though it were a bird chirping outside or a thunderstorm happening or, something that happens at a distance from you, because people's emotions vary from day to day. Another way to reduce the number of self-lies is to love yourself unconditionally. So that means to love yourself whether you're a good person or a bad person, no matter what you do, no matter what you say, no matter how much you embarrass yourself, no matter how much of a failure you are in romantic relationships, no matter if you get convicted of a felony, and end up in jail for the rest of your life, no matter what happens to you, you should commit to being unconditionally loving. Now, that doesn't mean giving yourself a pass for negative behavior. That's a different thing. But when it comes to the self, your experience of yourself and reality, be unconditionally loving and accepting of that. No matter what comes up is supposed to come up. So if you feel something, say, that's okay. Obviously, I was supposed to feel that way. If a thought comes up that you disagree with, it's like, okay, well, I disagree with that thought and that's okay, but it's also here. So be accepting of yourself. And you want to adopt the idea that your actions, your thoughts, and your emotions and urges, none of that can ever invalidate your existence at the present moment. If you exist right now, you're supposed to exist. If you weren't supposed to exist, you wouldn't exist. You are valid for being here. You don't have to prove your worth to be here. Because worth, number one, isn't a real thing, but even if it were a real thing, it doesn't determine whether or not you should be or not. Now, this is against all of the children's stories that you get told, where the bad people, they get the just desserts, and many of them end up dead, and then the good people end up getting the rewards. This sort of sets up a sort of dualistic, conditional loving situation in your mind, where you have to match up to some standard of goodness or to whatever you think is going to be the best way for you to be in order for you to love yourself. But those are that's conditional love. That's conditional admiration. It has nothing to do with love. Love is to accept reality as it is. So in our desire to be a worthwhile person, because of the illusion that somehow our thoughts, our feelings, our way of being, our actions can invalidate us in some way, we lie to ourselves. So if we think that people who aren't God-fearing people deserve to be punished or deserve to die, then we're going to be lying to ourselves in that direction to make ourselves feel more God-fearing. And it's going to be completely right over any more authentic experience in your reality that might stand in opposition to that. Or let's say, for example, you're taught that, oh, the most important thing is always to share. And so then you always feel the need to give everything away and give everything away all the time, even when it's negative for you, because you've lied to yourself and you've been mistaken, saying, oh, that's my worth. That's the thing that makes me deserving of reward and makes it to where I don't have to be punished or put out in some way. The thing that invalidates my existence is if I were to not share. This is honestly one of the worst problems in humanity. Another thing that you can do to cut down on your blind spots to your own self-lies and your ability to lie to yourself is to not believe every thought that you have. So, like I said before, thoughts just come up automatically as an automatic process. We don't really have control over it. We just kind of have the illusion of control over it because we've learned to identify ourselves with the thoughts. So what I'm saying is to disidentify with your thoughts. Just see them as a phenomenon, a very neutral phenomenon. And then you realize, oh, if my thoughts are a little voice, I don't have to believe what that little voice says because that little voice isn't necessarily right, doesn't necessarily know anything about me. So we tend to believe that little voice because we relate that little voice to ourself. Like that's the voice that belongs to us. That's the internal us that's happening. And so we have a tendency to say, oh yeah, I thought it about myself, and of course I know myself, and so it must be true. But that's not the case. Another thing in your ability to recognize self-deceptive thoughts and to cope with them and to be able to become more aware of them is to allow self-deceptive thoughts. Like I said, probably a good 95% or more of the thoughts that you have, at least the ones that are self-referential, are based in lies. And so don't interrupt these thought processes. Just let the ego do its thing. So for example, here's one that I still have hanging around that I keep continuously having to call myself out on and say, oh no, that's BS. Nope, that's not true. All right, so I have this little fantasy in my mind where I imagine that former coworkers of mine or people that I know now or people that I admire in general are somehow admiring me for being more conscious and being more wise, because that's one of my identifications. You know, I have this fancy YouTube channel now where I can espouse all of my wisdom, you know, so basically, you know, this becomes like a sort of like a spiritual ego or a wisdom ego kind of thing. It has nothing to do with the truth. You know, so I start to think in my head, it's like, oh yeah, if there were levels somehow that I could mention, like, oh, maybe my consciousness is expanded to a particular level, and oh, if that could be quantified and I could show how I'm like at least 2 levels above other people, and then those people would be really impressed with me and they would give me the approval that I want so much. And so I catch myself in this mindset from time to time, and I could just as easily believe it and say, oh yeah, that's definitely true. Certainly I'm a wise person, and look, you know, obviously this is true because I thought it. But then, you know, it's just a fantasy. That's all it is. It's my ego creating thoughts in order that I might see myself in a more positive light. Because at some level, I judge people who are less conscious or not as interested in wisdom or, you know, whatnot as lesser. And so I'm trying to distance myself away and try to set myself aside from other people. But the problem with that is that I'm not aside from other people, and there's no delineation between myself and others, not on the absolute level. There's an apparent separation, but that separation isn't real. But these are the types of thoughts that fortify our identification with our ego. So I have to call myself on my BS. I recognize, okay, number 1, this is not true. Number 2, this exists simply to bolster my self-image because somehow I feel inferior, and this is a good antidote for that in the moment. Then 3, I also have to realize that my whole entire worldview there isn't true. Because if I think that somehow consciousness has these very distinct levels that you can reach to, well, where are those levels? They're not really in our experience. That's just a framework that doesn't have anything to do with the truth. Now, I'm familiar with the Graves model, as probably many of you are, and that talks about human evolution. But you see, that's just a framework. That's an idea placed over reality, and it can be helpful in certain situations, but it doesn't have anything to do with truth. Number 4, I could also make myself aware of the fact that I'm judging other people who aren't as aware as lesser, and then to realize that awareness and consciousness as a trait, as something that someone has, wisdom, isn't necessarily, doesn't make that person more valuable or more valid to exist than anyone else. You know, so I can start to maybe be more compassionate and say that, hey, you know, maybe everybody just kind of goes their own way. And, you know, maybe some people might value wisdom, other people might value practicality, other people might value love, other people might value relationship. You know, all of these different things, you know, essentially are just very person to person. There's no objective thing in reality that says that this trait that I have over here is better than this trait that this person excels at over there. And another thing with this thought process is that even though I'm thinking, oh, look at me, I'm so wise, I'm so conscious, I'm so humble, it's anything but wise and conscious and humble, because I'm automatically thinking of myself as superior to others. So that's not humble. And then conscious, you know, obviously if I were more conscious, I wouldn't be having this thought process where I'm having to create this separation between myself and others. Anyway, so that's all I have for you today. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead, click the like button below and subscribe. Also, check out my blog at thediamondnet.org and sign up for content updates. I post on my blog every Sunday, and it basically just goes into a little bit more depth with my personal progress of doing consciousness work in everyday life. And you know, things that I maybe don't get a chance to mention in my videos sort of end up in my blog, so definitely scour that for my personal insights. Other than that, that's all I have, and until next time, keep becoming more you.